There was a time not that long ago when even saying this out loud would have sounded ridiculous. If you told people that a female basketball player would one day outshine the biggest stars in the NBA, not in highlights, not in headlines, but in raw cultural impact, you would have been laughed out of the room. It wasn't supposed to happen. The system wasn't built for it. The audience wasn't there. Or at least, that's what everyone kept saying. And yet, here we are. Because while critics were waiting for the hype to cool off, something very different was happening behind the scenes. Quietly. Consistently. The kind of momentum that doesn't spike and disappear, but compounds. The kind that doesn't need viral moments to survive. It just keeps growing. What makes this even harder to wrap your head around is that this takeover didn't happen during a dominant MVP season, or after a championship run, or even while she was lighting up the court every night. In fact, some of the most jaw-dropping proof came when she wasn't playing at all. That's the part people didn't see coming. Because Caitlin Clark didn't just change the conversation around women's basketball. She broke the logic people used to explain why something like this couldn't happen in the first place. And once that logic collapsed, everything else started to look different. The question isn't whether this moment is real anymore. The question is how deep it actually goes. At first, people tried to explain it away as hype. A hot streak. A media moment that would cool off once the next storyline came along. But then the numbers dropped, and suddenly there was nowhere left to hide. Because this wasn't coming from fans arguing online or commentators trying to push a narrative. This came from professional sports authenticator, the gold standard of the collectibles world. The place that doesn't care about vibes, feelings, or debates. They just track what people are actually spending their money on. And when their annual data came out, it hit like a slap in the face. She wasn't just popular. She wasn't just leading women's basketball. She became the most collected active basketball player in the world. Not women's basketball. Not college. All of basketball. Ahead of every active NBA star you can think of. Players with championships. MVPs. Decades-long legacies. And here's the detail that made even longtime collectors pause. She did it while injured. While sitting on the bench. While not putting up stat lines. While not giving the market new highlights to chase. People weren't reacting to what she was doing that week. They were betting on what she represents long-term. That's a completely different kind of belief. Then came the state-by-state breakdown. Collectors across the country weren't just submitting her cards in big markets or basketball-heavy cities. It was everywhere. Coast to coast. State after state, her name showed up more than anyone else's. Not by a little. By a margin that made it obvious this wasn't coincidence or a short-term surge. And when you zoomed out even further, it got stranger. 3 of the 10 most graded cards across all sports that year belonged to her. Not just basketball. Football, baseball, everything. In an industry where attention usually fragments fast, people were all leaning in the same direction. That's when the conversation quietly changed. Because this stopped being about fandom and started looking a lot more like confidence. The kind that shows up when people believe something is going to matter more tomorrow than it does today. The kind that usually surrounds only the rarest athletes, the ones who outgrow the sport itself. And once that realization set in, a much bigger question followed. If this kind of momentum was building without her even playing, what exactly were people preparing for? There's a huge difference between popularity and what was happening here. Popularity is loud. It spikes. It fades. What this looked like was something quieter, and a lot more serious. In the collectibles world, people aren't just buying memories. They're buying signals. Signals about relevance, longevity, and cultural gravity. When collectors start acting in unison, it usually means they're responding to something bigger than highlights. They're reacting to a shift. That's why this data made seasoned hobby insiders uncomfortable. Because this kind of behavior usually shows up around only a handful of names. The athletes who don't just dominate their era, but define it. The ones whose value keeps climbing even when they're off the court. Even when the season pauses. Even when the headlines move on. That's when it became clear this wasn't a basketball conversation anymore. This was about visibility, reach, Influence. About how many people felt connected to one player's story, and how confident they were that connection was only going to grow. You don't get that from casual fans. You get it from people who believe a figure is becoming unavoidable. And that belief didn't come from league marketing or media campaigns. Came from moments that felt organic. From people tuning in who never watched women's basketball before. From clips traveling far outside sports circles. From debates that kept resurfacing no matter how often critics tried to shut them down. At some point, the skepticism stopped sounding analytical and started sounding defensive. Because once someone becomes a cultural signal, they force uncomfortable questions. About who gets attention. About who drives value. About whether old assumptions still apply. And the louder those questions got, the more obvious it became that this momentum wasn't fragile at all. It was insulated. Which explains why the next ripple didn't come from fans, commentators, or even the league itself. Came from money. For years, Nike didn't just dominate sports culture, it defined it. If you were the face of the future, Nike found you early. They didn't wait for consensus. They didn't wait for proof. They moved fast, bet big, and shaped the narrative around you. That's why what happened next felt so off. As Caitlin Clark's pull kept growing, fans expected the obvious move. A signature shoe. A full-court press. The kind of rollout Nike used to do in its sleep. Instead, nothing happened. Months passed. Demand got louder. And still, silence. Online, the frustration started boiling over. Not in a manufactured way, but in that organic, messy way brands hate. People weren't asking politely anymore. They were confused. Why was the biggest draw in women's basketball not getting the treatment Nike usually reserves for can't-miss stars? The comparison that followed made it worse. When another elite player received her signature shoe first, the conversation shifted from impatience to optics. Not because that athlete didn't deserve it, but because timing matters. Momentum matters. And Nike looked like it was reacting instead of leading. That perception hit at the worst possible moment. Because outside of basketball, Nike was already under pressure. Sales had softened. Stock performance had taken a hit. Critics were saying the brand had lost its edge. Lost its instinct. That it was slower now. More corporate. Less willing to trust its gut. And suddenly, Caitlin Clark wasn't just a missed opportunity. She became a symbol of that criticism. What made this even stranger was that the demand wasn't hypothetical. People weren't saying they might buy her shoe. They were openly saying they were waiting. Ready. Cash in hand. The kind of consumer energy brands spend millions trying to manufacture. Nike didn't manufacture this. They inherited it. And for a while, it looked like they didn't know what to do with it. But what the public didn't see was that something had already started shifting behind closed doors. Public opinion is noisy. It flips fast. But money, especially at the highest level, tends to move quietly and with purpose. That's why what happened next raised eyebrows in rooms far away from basketball. Near the end of the year, filings revealed that Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, had personally bought a massive block of Nike stock. Not through a fund. Not as part of some automatic compensation package. This was his own money. And that detail mattered. Tim Cook doesn't chase turnarounds for fun. He doesn't need speculative upside. When someone in that position commits real capital to a struggling brand, it's usually because they see a catalyst others haven't fully priced in yet. Something concrete. Something timed. Then came the second move. Nike's own CEO, Elliott Hill, also bought heavily into the company. Again, not symbolic. Not a PR gesture. A serious purchase that signaled confidence from the inside. The kind executives avoid if they're unsure about what's coming next. That combination changed the read entirely. Because now this wasn't about whether Nike had made mistakes in the past. It was about whether they believed a correction was already underway. And more importantly, what they believed would drive it. Around the same time, internal numbers started turning. North American revenue ticked up. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. After years of stagnation, even a modest rebound carried weight. especially when it lined up with renewed focus on basketball and women's sports. None of this was announced with fireworks. There was no press release connecting the dots. But for people who track patterns instead of narratives, the message was clear. Nike wasn't betting on a general comeback. They were betting on a moment. And moments like that usually center around a person, not a product. Up to this point, everything had been speculation. Data points. Market behavior. Quiet moves by powerful people. But then Caitlin Clark herself filled in a piece of the puzzle, almost casually. During a podcast conversation, she talked about shoes the way elite players actually do when the cameras aren't rolling. Not as fashion. Not as branding. As tools. She mentioned how picky she is, how certain models just feel right, and how anything tied to her name would need to meet a very specific standard. Not equal to what exists. Better. What stood out wasn't what she revealed. It was what she didn't. There were no flashy promises. No marketing buzzwords. Just a calm confidence that something new was coming, and that it wasn't rushed. That the technology mattered. That performance came first. And that whatever people were waiting for would be worth the delay. That single moment reframed everything. Suddenly, Nike's hesitation didn't look like confusion. It looked like restraint. The kind brands rarely show anymore. Because building something new, truly new, takes time. And getting it wrong would have been worse than waiting. It also explained why the interest never cooled off. People weren't just waiting for a shoe. They were waiting for her version of it. The one shaped by how she actually plays. The one that reflects why her game looks different in the first place. And if you've been following this story closely so far, you're already ahead of most of the conversation. This is the kind of shift that doesn't show up in box scores, but ends up changing how the entire league is watched. If you like breaking down moments like this before they fully explode, sticking around makes a lot of sense. Because the real test wasn't whether the product would land. It was whether the audience would show up when she did. When Caitlin Clark finally stepped back onto the floor after months away, it wasn't even supposed to matter. No stakes. No standings. Not a real game in the traditional sense. Just a preseason exhibition against a team most casual fans couldn't name. And yet, the building sold out almost instantly. That alone would have been notable. But what happened next exposed something much bigger. The buzz didn't stay local. Networks took notice. The game was picked up for national broadcast, turning a glorified tune-up into an event. Over 1 million people tuned in. For a pre-season exhibition. To put that in context, those numbers live in territory usually reserved for championship games. And this wasn't fueled by rivalry, drama, or playoff pressure. It was fueled by curiosity. By anticipation. By people wanting to see what happened next. That same pattern had already shown up earlier. Games featuring her consistently outperformed expectations. Not by narrow margins, but by leaps. Even as viewing metrics shifted and measurement systems expanded, one thing stayed consistent. When she played, the audience followed. And that's the part no marketing campaign can fake. Viewers weren't being pulled in by league loyalty. Many of them weren't regular WNBA watchers at all. They were tuning in for one reason. One storyline. One player. The kind of attention networks crave and schedule around. At that point, the conversation stopped being theoretical. Because when a single return game can rival the audience of a final series, it forces a reckoning. About scheduling. About coverage. About where the value actually lives. And once networks start adjusting around one name, the ripple effects become impossible to ignore. The math had changed. And with a full return looming, plus a long off-season of build-up still ahead, the only real question left was how high those numbers could go. When you lay it all out, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The collectibles market didn't wait for permission. It crowned her while she was injured. Investors didn't follow headlines. They followed timing. Executives put real money on the line before the public narrative caught up. Networks adjusted schedules. Fans showed up for games that weren't supposed to matter. None of that happens by accident. This isn't just the rise of a star player. It's the emergence of a cultural force that doesn't rely on tradition, gatekeepers, or even the league itself to validate it. Caitlin Clark didn't fit the old blueprint, so she quietly made it irrelevant. They said the attention would fade. It didn't. They said missing time would slow things down. It didn't. They said the moment was manufactured. The numbers proved otherwise. And now, with a full return ahead, a signature shoe on the way, and the spotlight brighter than ever, the conversation is shifting from if this changes women's basketball to how much. Because once someone becomes appointment viewing, once they move markets without stepping on the floor, once they force every stakeholder to react instead of lead, they're no longer just part of the sport. They're bigger than it. If you made it this far, you already understand why this moment matters. Drop a comment with where you think this goes next. Hit like if this breakdown gave you a new perspective, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the next chapter actually unfolds. This story isn't slowing down, and neither are we.